As a founder, you might be curious about the concept of self-management. After all, what's not to find enticing about a way of working that releases you from decision-making, encourages real accountability, and gives your team the true power to make an impact? As a coach who supported founders and their teams over the past 8 years to adopt self-management and new ways of working, I know that it can feel risky, abstract, and even completely chaotic. A workplace without managers? Sounds radical. That's why in this video, I want to share with you what self-management looks like in practice so that you understand what it really means to work in this way. Before I dive into the practices and what these look like, I want to put a caveat here that there are now many hundreds of self-managing organizations all over the world. And while some of them have similarities in how they do things, they've all found their own unique approach in how they want to self-manage. So what I just want to say is that some of the examples I share will not be exactly the same in all self-managing organizations. What I always say when any team is starting out on the self-management journey is to just pick a few practices that can help you right now, something to experiment with. So while I'm covering lots of different practices in this video, maybe just pick one or two that you can take away to experiment with. One of the common myths around self-management is that it's completely structureless, and that creates this chaotic, laissez-faire environment where absolutely everything and anything goes. That's often because we have this idea that because we're not in that pyramid hierarchy with layers of management controlling and checking everything that's going on, then surely what on earth are people doing? But the reality is we have to replace that for more structure, practices, and processes that hold the team together and create boundaries. So while this can sometimes feel like it's constricting freedom, what it actually allows us to do is to have a mutual understanding and boundaries for how we get to self-manage together. Many of the founders that I've had the privilege of working with, but also interviewing on my podcast, have had this sense that actually, is this structure going to feel really limiting? When in reality, it's been both liberating for themselves and their team. At a micro level, in most self-managing organizations, you'll witness two very clear and common practices, and that is clear meeting structures and clear decision-making processes. And if we go even deeper to a macro level, the meeting structures aren't just for day-to-day work, operational work, but also around governance of the team and of the organization. A question that I'm often asked when I'm public speaking or sharing about self-management is what happens to managers? And it is a very valid question because after all, in the current system of work, many organizations have become heavily reliant on that managerial figure, being that centralized individual right in the middle of the organization, moving decisions up and down the organization, filtering information. So what happens to these roles if we're trying to create a more decentralized, self-managing organization? And the reality is we have to think differently about the role of manager. Now, there are a number of bad examples of self-management in practice. I'm not going to name any brands here, but what they believed self-management was just removing the management layers and just being like, yep, that's self-management, right? No managers. But then what happens is we create a vacuum, a void, and that doesn't support the team or the organization in understanding what role those managers were playing and how they can support the team in moving forward. So we have to think differently about managers. Now, commonly what happens is, yes, we remove some of the management layers, but what happens here is we think about the skills of these managers. Do they become experts in a particular field? Can they become mediators or facilitators? Or do they become team coaches, which is totally different from that traditional lens of manager? We're no longer controlling and checking the work. We're much more of a coach and supporter to the team, enabling them and supporting them in making their own decisions rather than being the one that has the final say. One example is the Dutch bank ABN AMRO, who during their self-management journey went from 4 layers of management just to 1. And what they did was redistribute their managers between experts in their field and team coaches. Decision making is one of the first practices that teams will look at when they're starting on their self-management journey. And there are so many different decision-making processes that we can adopt. For example, the advice-based process or consent-based decision-making. What happens is the teams learn these decision-making processes and decide which ones they want to use. Decisions are also distributed between teams and individuals. Who has the authority over a particular aspect of work? And this is where we can start to distribute some of the authority outwards rather than centralizing it all at the top. Teams also learn to differentiate between operational day-to-day work decisions and policy and governance decisions. And they may have different practices depending on what type of decision they are making. One example of this that I want to share is I was hired by a small tech company who wanted to improve their hybrid working policy. But what they didn't want to do is to have it as a top-down mandate of how this would work. They knew that the team and the business all needed to make sure their needs were met. So what we did was a version of consent-based decision-making. We gathered input from the team. We held a full session about understanding the different needs, understanding what areas need to be covered. And the team co-created a proposal of their hybrid working policy before we then created a consent process where everyone consented to work with this policy for at least a minimum of 3 months. That is just one powerful example of how we can include people in the decisions that affect them. A practice I want to highlight in this video is that teams set team goals. So in self-managing organizations, what you will often find is that a particular group, it could be the founder and other key stakeholders, have created the business strategy. And then what happens is the teams create their goals from this strategy. So they kind of draw down from that strategy of, okay, if this is the business strategy, the vision, the mission that we're going towards, what is it that we want to achieve over the next 3 to 6 months? So they will set their own KPIs, their own goals, and that way they are so much more motivated towards them than if they were being mandated down. Now, when I talk about this aspect, there are often reservations and skepticism because people say things like, oh, well, that just means that the teams could set themselves really easy goals and never really perform very well. First of all, that mindset itself reeks of a lack of trust. So we need to go all the way back to the start and really build on trust before we do any self-managing practices. But also you've got to realize that actually when we set our own goals, we're so much more motivated and excited by them rather than when they're coming from the top down. And of course, that doesn't mean that we're working in silos when we're in a self-managing organization. We're so interdependent on each other and this peer-to-peer based system that we're building that even if a team did set unrealistic, very weak goals, we would soon find out about it and the system would have to self-correct. If you want to take self-management even further, many organizations also get their team involved in building the strategy, in creating the vision and the mission. One example of this is Team Maiden, who I interviewed on my podcast because they've created a very collaborative process in order to create their business strategy. I've spoken in depth about how self-managing organizations work more with roles rather than titles. So I will make sure to link that video below. But essentially, this doesn't mean we have to completely abandon job titles altogether. After all, as an external label, they can often be really helpful, whether that's with suppliers or customers. But we're just no longer attaching so much worth and so much value to those job titles. What we're doing is looking at the hats that people wear and the roles that people play and how work actually gets executed. So it could be, for example, that even as a founder, you may have that as your external label, but inside the organization, you're wearing lots of different hats. You might be a mentor, you might be the person around doing public speaking, you might be the person doing investor relations. So you're wearing lots of different hats, and that's what we work with rather than job title. In a lot of self-managing organizations, they've even given their teams some boundaries to help them create their own job titles so they can put anything on their business card or their email signature, just as long as it follows a certain criteria. After all, there are still some titles that come with the weight of legality. Learning and development also looks different in self-managing organizations because in practice, we're no longer following this hierarchical career ladder up the chain. What we're doing is really focusing as individuals on what it is that we want to do, the skills, the expertise that we want to bring to the organization. So learning and development becomes so much more personalized. It's less on the company to consistently provide that management pathway. And it's again more of a collaborative process about what the company can offer in terms of skills and training and budget, but it's on the individual to co-create their career pathway. Where do they want to be? What do they want to be doing? And what skills and knowledge do they want to acquire? One of my favorite examples of learning and development in practice in a self-managing organization is the learning mosaic that has been adopted by PTHR. I've even done another video on that, so I'll make sure I link that below. But essentially, people create this beautiful mosaic of the things that not only they know already, but that they would like to learn or like to upskill themselves on. So each mosaic is totally unique to the individual. Something that can feel a little uncomfortable when we're starting out on the self-management journey is the reality that transparency and communication increases. Because we want to give people more power around decision making and support them in really understanding the wider landscape of their work in the business, we then have to increase transparency. So this can feel really uncomfortable for people because we are opening up meeting minutes, we're opening up meetings if people want to be involved. We're also sharing financial information. You know, a lot of companies in self-managing organizations will share how well the business is doing, giving people this commercial awareness. This practice has been going on for a long time in self-managing organizations, as Ricardo Semler introduced it at his manufacturing company, Semco, where they literally taught people how to read the business statements and the accounts to give people that high level of transparency and information to understand how their work impacted how well the business was doing. So what you will often see in self-managing organizations is a high level of transparency and communication. Open town halls where founders and leaders are sharing what's going on, answering uncomfortable questions, and also not having that kind of hidden agenda or hiding information. Everything is open and accessible. Something you might notice immediately when you're visiting a self-managing organization is the high level of feedback-rich environment that gets created. That's because we are instilling feedback in habits, in the very system itself, and upskilling everyone with the ability to not only ask for feedback, but also give and receive feedback. So we are creating this really feedback-rich environment. Even at a small scale, we often have feedback at the end of a meeting so that we can understand, how did that meeting go? How was the facilitator? Did everyone have time to participate in that meeting? So we're in this environment where we're always using feedback as a tool to learn and develop. So what you will often see is that people are asking each other for feedback. You'll notice that there's a habit where someone will openly say, can you give me some feedback on that? Or I'm working on this. Would you be able to tell me how I can improve? So there's a really high personal development piece around feedback. We also have systems and habits. So even at a really small level, you can add in a feedback round in your meeting structures where you basically share, how did that meeting go? How do we feel that that went? How was the facilitator? Did we feel like we covered everything and people had time to share what they needed to? So we are creating feedback-rich environments in self-managing organizations. And this might feel strange to begin with, but you are in that constant feedback loop of learning and iterating. So self-managing organizations, in practice, you will see a high level of feedback happening. A final question that I want to answer is what happens to the founders? What happens to leadership if we're suddenly decentralizing and giving the team more autonomy and decision-making power? What happens to the founders? Now, from those that I've worked with and those that I've interviewed on my podcast, this becomes such a liberating experience for them, because what they get to do is focus on their zone of genius, the thing that they are really good at, where their passion lies, where when they began this business, they wanted to do more of that. It's just that they got tied up in the day-to-day decision making and people managing, and all of these things they're really good at kind of went to the wayside. So what I often see is founders doing the things that they love again, enjoying the very business they've built, but also starting to look at innovation and creativity and how the business can evolve and sustain. Like I said at the start, there are now hundreds of companies practicing self-management all over the world. Some of them have been doing this for decades. So this isn't something new. This might just feel new because we are so used to the traditional way of working, that paradigm of the old. But actually, there are so many amazing examples and case studies out there that we can all learn from. So what I'd recommend you do is also jump onto my podcast, where I've interviewed some of these amazing founders who are working in this way. And also, if you want to start on your self-management journey, I've done a video on the best things to do to begin with. So I'll make sure that I link that here as well. But thank you so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you next week.